There is a way to cool your home down by double digits in the middle of summer using nothing more than baked earth and a little bit of water. No compressor, no refrigerant, no motor, and no electricity bill that climbs every time the temperature outside does. It is one of the oldest cooling technologies known to humanity, and it has quietly been reinvented for the modern world, dropping air temperatures inside industrial buildings by tens of degrees, using a shape borrowed from a beehive and a material you can buy at any garden center. So what is this thing? How does a stack of clay actually chill the air passing through it? And if it works this well, why isn't every home in a hot climate using one? Let's get into it. To understand where this comes from, you have to go back to the deserts of the ancient Middle East, long before anyone had the first idea what a compressor even was. In places like Persia and Egypt, keeping a room livable in the summer wasn't a comfort question, it was a survival question. Temperatures in these regions routinely pushed past 110 degrees, and there was no machine on Earth that could fix that. So the people living there turned to the material under their feet. They noticed that a plain, unglazed clay jar left full of water in a moving breeze didn't just hold that water, it actually cooled the air drifting past it. There was no chemistry lesson behind that discovery, just generations of people paying close attention to what worked. And that single observation eventually grew into entire architectural traditions. Perforated stone and clay screens started showing up on the windows of grand houses, designed specifically to catch the wind and pull the heat out of it as it passed through, while also filtering out dust and giving the occupants inside a bit of privacy from the street. In Persia, that same thinking scaled up into towering mud brick structures that could manufacture literal ice in the middle of a desert, using nothing but shade, wind, and evaporation, working together across an entire building rather than a single object. These towers weren't decoration, they were functioning refrigeration infrastructure for cities that had no other way of preserving food or comfort through the hottest months of the year. Centuries later, when this knowledge spread into India under Mughal rule, emperors were building entire cooling houses out of sandstone and water, some of them elaborate enough to chill rooms for royalty without a single moving part. There are accounts of emperors organizing relay systems to haul ice down from mountain ranges just to keep these palace cooling houses stocked. But the far more interesting detail is that the simpler domestic versions, shallow pans, and straw-lined pits used by ordinary households worked almost as well using nothing but evaporation and the natural properties of clay and earth. The point of all this history isn't just trivia. It's proof that cooling a building with clay and water isn't some fringe idea someone dreamed up recently. It's a technology that kept entire civilizations comfortable for thousands of years before it was pushed aside by the chemical refrigerants of the 20th century. Refrigerants that solved the same problem but did it by burning fuel and consuming electricity instead of simply working with the materials already available. The modern chapter of this story starts less than a decade ago in New Delhi. An architect there was called in to solve a genuinely brutal problem. A factory generator was pumping out so much waste heat that the air around it had become almost unbearable, and standard air conditioning wasn't going to touch it at any reasonable cost. Both because of the sheer scale of the heat load and because running compressors hard enough to fight it would have been prohibitively expensive to operate around the clock. Instead of reaching for bigger compressors, he looked at the geometry of a beehive, a shape that packs enormous surface area into a small footprint, and asked whether that same structure could be built out of unglazed terracotta tubing to cool industrial-scale air. What came out of that experiment is now sometimes called the beehive cooler, and it works on a single, very old law of physics. When water turns from a liquid into a vapor, it has to steal heat from its surroundings to do it. That's evaporative cooling, and it's the exact same principle behind why you feel cold stepping out of a swimming pool on a windy day, or why sweating cools your skin down on a hot afternoon. The body and this device are, in a strange way, running the same trick. But the clever part isn't just the water, it's the clay itself. Unglazed terracotta is riddled with microscopic pores, and when you wet it, those pores pull water through the material by capillary action, the same way a paper towel drags liquid up from a puddle without anything pushing it. Wet the base of the stack, and within minutes, the entire surface of the clay is holding a thin, even film of moisture all on its own. with no pump required to keep it saturated once the process gets going, and no motor forcing water anywhere it doesn't naturally want to travel. Now, if you just had one flat, wet wall, the air moving past it wouldn't pick up much cooling. It would simply skim the surface and move on without much of it ever making contact with the moisture. That's why the honeycomb shape matters so much. By packing hundreds of narrow terracotta tubes together into a single dense structure, you create a massive amount of wet surface area crammed into a small space, far more contact between air and moisture than any flat surface could ever offer in the same footprint. As hot air gets pulled into each individual tube, the curved walls force it into a tight spinning motion, which means almost every molecule of that air is forced into direct contact with the moist clay instead of drifting harmlessly through the middle untouched. And there's a second trick layered on top of that. Because the openings in the honeycomb are narrow, the air speeds up as it's squeezed through them. And faster moving air pulls moisture off the clay even quicker, which drops the temperature further still. It's a compounding effect, spin plus speed plus surface area, all stacked on top of the basic evaporative principle, and each one makes the others work harder. By the time that air comes out the other side, it's been stripped of a huge amount of its heat and arrives as a dense, cool breeze that can feel more than 20 degrees colder than the air that went in, all without a single watt going into moving that air beyond whatever natural breeze or small fan is pushing it through in the first place. In that original Delhi factory, this stack of clay tubing took air that was pushing past 120 degrees and brought it down into the high 90s in a setting where conventional air conditioning had already been ruled out as impractical, both on cost and on sheer capacity. And the benefits weren't purely thermal. Unlike a standard air conditioner, which wrings the humidity out of the air and often leaves it feeling flat and stale, this system adds a gentle, natural humidity back into the room, closer to what your body actually wants than the dry, over-conditioned air a compressor typically produces. It also produces that distinct earthy smell you get when rain hits dry soil after a long dry spell. And there's real research suggesting that smell alone changes how warm a space feels to the people breathing it, on top of whatever the thermometer says, which means the perceived comfort of a room can end up even better than the raw numbers suggest. From an energy standpoint, the difference was staggering. To deliver the same cooling with a conventional mechanical system would have required a serious amount of continuous electrical draw, the kind of load that adds up fast when you're running it, hour after hour through an entire summer. This clay stack did the job on a tiny fraction of that, running on barely more power than it takes to keep a couple of light bulbs lit. And that's before you even consider that a fair amount of that setup can run on nothing but a small solar panel and a low-voltage pump, meaning the ongoing cost can drop to essentially nothing once it's built. Which brings us to the obvious question. If a handful of baked clay pots can outcool a mechanical system for pennies, why isn't this sitting in every backyard from Arizona to Florida? The first honest answer is climate. Evaporative cooling like this leans entirely on dry air. Pump humid air through a wet honeycomb, and there's nowhere for that extra moisture to go. The evaporation slows down, and the cooling effect collapses with it, sometimes to the point where it barely does anything at all. That's exactly why this technology thrives across the historically arid regions it came from, and exactly why it struggles the moment you move it somewhere humid, no matter how well you build it or how much water you run through it. If you're in the desert Southwest or anywhere with genuinely dry summer air, this is a phenomenal fit. If you're somewhere sticky and humid for half the year, it's fighting physics it simply can't win. And no amount of clever honeycomb geometry changes that basic limitation. But climate is only part of the story, because plenty of homes across the Sunbelt sit in exactly the kind of dry heat this technology was built for, and you still don't see it on rooftops. That comes down to how the cooling industry itself is built. Air conditioning is a business model as much as it's a machine. A compressor unit is a complicated piece of hardware with dozens of moving parts, designed to need servicing every year and full replacement every decade or so. There's a whole supply chain, from manufacturers to installers to parts distributors to the technicians who show up when it breaks. That depends on that unit eventually failing and being swapped out. A stack of terracotta tubes that can last for decades with almost zero maintenance doesn't generate any of that recurring revenue. Nobody's selling you a service contract on a garden pot, and nobody's making a margin on replacement parts for something that barely has any parts to replace. And then there's the way modern homes are built in the first place. For the better part of the last 50 years, residential construction in hot climates has been built around the sealed envelope model. Airtight boxes that depend entirely on mechanical systems to manage the air inside them. A cooling method that needs a genuine flow of outside air moving through it doesn't slot neatly into that framework, and it often gets excluded from primary living spaces by the building code before anyone's even poured a foundation, simply because the entire regulatory system was written with mechanical, sealed, measurable systems in mind. On top of that, in rental housing especially, the person choosing the cooling system almost never pays the monthly electricity bill. Landlords install the cheapest unit that passes inspection, tenants absorb the running cost, and nobody in that chain has any incentive to install something more efficient but less familiar. Even when that something would save real money over the years it's in use. The good news is that none of that stops you from building one of these yourself, because the underlying physics behind this system is about as open source as it gets. If you want to put together a working version this weekend, the simplest route is what's sometimes called the flower pot method. Start with unglazed terracotta, either plain drainage pipe sections or basic garden pots. And this part really matters, they have to be unglazed. If the clay's been fired with any kind of glossy decorative coating, those microscopic pores get sealed shut, and water can't migrate through the material to reach the surface, which kills the whole effect before it starts, no matter how good the rest of your build is. Once you've got your unglazed pieces, arrange them into a tight honeycomb pattern inside a simple wooden or metal frame, packed close enough together that air passing through has to squeeze between them rather than drift around the outside. That geometry alone is what turns a pile of wet pots into an actual cooling engine, instead of just a damp decoration sitting in the corner of a patio. From there, you can run it as simply as pouring water over the top by hand every so often, and letting gravity and capillary action do the rest, which works fine if you're only using it occasionally or you don't mind the manual upkeep. But if you want it to run itself, add a small, low-voltage fountain pump sitting in a shallow reservoir at the base, feeding a thin manifold of tubing that drips water evenly across the top of the stack. That keeps the clay consistently saturated without you needing to think about it day to day. And if you want the whole thing to run completely off-grid, wire that little pump to a small solar panel. The hotter and sunnier the day gets, the harder the pump works and the more water it moves, which means the cooling effect actually scales up right when you need it most, without a thermostat, a controller, or a single line of code telling it what to do. It's a self-regulating loop built entirely out of sunlight, water, and gravity, which is about as close to a maintenance-free machine as you're ever going to get. If you want to go bigger than a backyard build, this same idea has already been scaled up into architectural facades for entire buildings by design studios working in this space, adapting the honeycomb structure into modular panels that can be built into the exterior walls of larger buildings rather than sitting as a standalone unit, which opens the door to cooling whole workspaces or communal areas rather than just a single room. And if you want to actually learn the fundamentals hands-on, rather than guessing your way through it, there are architecture and permaculture groups running workshops specifically on passive cooling and traditional building techniques like this one, which is a solid next step if you end up wanting to take this further than a weekend project and start thinking about integrating it into an actual structure. It's also worth being realistic about where this fits into a broader home cooling strategy, because it's not a total replacement for mechanical air conditioning in every situation. It's a tool that works best when it's matched to the right climate and the right expectations. In a genuinely dry, hot region, a well-built unit can meaningfully cut how hard your existing AC has to work, or in some cases, replace it entirely for shaded outdoor living spaces, workshops, or converted garages where you're not trying to fight humidity as well as heat. It's less about throwing out every modern system you own, and more about recognizing that a huge amount of the mechanical cooling infrastructure we've built our lives around exists because it was profitable to sell, not necessarily because it was the only thing that worked. At the end of the day, this is a genuinely old idea that never actually stopped working. It just got pushed out of the conversation by an industry built around selling you something that eventually breaks. A stack of clay and a bit of water, arranged the right way, can pull real, measurable heat out of the air using nothing but evaporation and geometry. The same two forces that were keeping desert cities livable thousands of years before anyone had heard of a refrigerant. It's not going to replace a compressor in a humid climate. And it's not going to show up on a builder's standard spec sheet anytime soon. But if you're in a hot, dry part of the country and you're willing to build it yourself, it might be one of the cheapest, most effective cooling upgrades you'll ever put together, and one that keeps working for decades with almost nothing asked of you in return. A lot of what we cover on this channel isn't new technology. It's old technology that got sidelined because nobody could figure out how to keep selling it to you. If that's the kind of thing you find interesting, subscribing and sharing is genuinely the best way to make sure content like this keeps finding its way to people. And if you want to see how this exact same evaporative principle was used to build an off-grid refrigerator that's now saving lives across Nigeria without a drop of electricity, that video is right here.